So now we will move on to, is it steady? Okay. Now we will move on to the third and final thesis. I got a little bit excited there, involving the physical resurrection of Jesus. Let me pull that up. The physical resurrection of Jesus is a true historical event, further evidenced in the testimonies of Jesus' community, early Christian belief, and the transformation of witnesses. I phrased the defenses for this one a little bit differently. First, I decided to go with the naturalistic arguments that attempt to negate the resurrection, and then the evidence that supports it. So I'm going to begin by explaining some of these naturalistic explanations that try to essentially explain away the resurrection and what it was, and then continue on to the evidence that Habermas provides, as well as the strategy in which he used to provide it. So there are three primary naturalistic explanations that attempt to, just explain away the resurrection of Jesus. The alternative explanations of David Hume, who criticized the miraculous nature of the resurrection, and the 19th century trends involving hallucinations and the swoon theory. The swoon theory is that Jesus did not die on the cross, but merely fainted, was buried, survived being buried alive, got up, and walked away. As you can see, that one is a bit far-fetched. David Hume was very criticized as well because his argument essentially states that it cannot be miraculous because miracles don't exist, and in philosophy that is not a valid argument. You cannot just describe away the validity of something based off of its divine nature, because divinity and phenomena exist, and that is an important thing to remember. So Habermas states that essentially all singular arguments for the resurrection cannot account for the vast factual data in support of the resurrection, meaning that you would have to combine arguments together for data to be less overwhelming in favor of the resurrection. However, even then, it's a bit complicated and sticky and just not very good. So he uses an example of this concerning the hallucination theory. There are several key defenses in favor of the resurrection. The first one being that hallucinations are an individual event. They happen in one individual's mind. They are not a group event, but Jesus is historically recorded several times, even in groups as large as 500 people being seen, and there are several witnesses that attest to seeing him at the same time. So this argument doesn't really work. In addition, it appears that there were a wide variety of people Jesus saw, everyone from soft-hearted Mary to his brother James, who was a bit more cold toward him before seeing him, to Paul, and we all know how that was because before that he was Saul. And none of these people have a hallucinogenic history, so they don't have a history of hallucinations. The naturalist attempt to explain this away is that these hallucinations were founded because what happened was these people that saw Jesus wanted to see him so badly. They had these preconditions of hopeful expectations, and they just wanted to see him so badly that they all did. But it says several times in the Bible that even though Jesus had prophesied to them the resurrection and his death, the disciples did not expect him to rise, neither did his mother or his brother. And so the rejection of these natural theses are very justifiable under these evidential apologetics methodologies, meaning even just in these historical events of Jesus appearing to people and transformation of these witnesses, it's enough to say that these explanations don't work. But switching, there's a lot of evidence that supports the resurrection of Jesus under these historical events located in the New Testament. Paul alone is crazy, guys. Paul, there's so much evidence that supports Jesus' resurrection, and it's centered around him, which I find really interesting. But in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul attests that he personally witnessed Jesus after he had that was an interesting word. You know what I was trying to say. He attests that Jesus witnessed to him after he had risen. There we go. Paul additionally testifies that additional apostles had been preaching the resurrection of Christ around the same time he was, with no previous communication between them or anything like that. And they realized this during a conference, and this is located in Acts 15 is where it's recorded. Additional Pauline reports claim that Jesus appeared to many groups. These groups included many of the apostles, as well as the group that I mentioned earlier that included as much as 500 people. But moving away from Paul, we have witnesses that were completely transformed by the resurrection of Jesus, including his brother James, who was not a believer until after he saw Jesus' resurrection, and then he became a wholehearted mover for Christ, is what I would call him. And even the Jewish leaders had to acknowledge the emptiness of the tomb that Jesus was once buried in. Some naturalists, just to play the devil's advocate, would say that the disciples may have stolen the body out of the tomb, but this was very unlikely due to the nature of the guards versus in comparison to the disciples and their bodily stature and everything like that. Basically, Jesus died. He was literally dead, and then he wasn't dead anymore, is what these arguments are trying to say. Later in their life, all of the disciples would be crucified for their dedication to the testimony of the resurrection. This argument was implemented through the, quote, minimal fact strategy by Gary Habermas. Essentially, instead of asking preliminary questions and then trying to establish the trustworthiness of the gospel using textual criticism and scriptures and translations and things like that, Gary Habermas essentially just uses facts. Like, he just says, this is what it says, this is what it is, and the textual criticism and everything else can stand on its own in a previous way. In the end, Jesus experienced a biological death and resurrection, essentially fulfilling the prophecies that he made and making a way for us to come into a relationship with him. And this is the outstanding argument of all evidential apologetics, is that Jesus lived, he did miracles, he died, was buried, and through this we can come into a relationship with him, and that's really good for us. So we only have one more video, guys, so bear with me, and thank you so much for watching.